It was the night of Halloween, and the air was thick with excitement as children, teenagers, and adults alike paraded through the crowded carnival grounds. The festival had taken over the entire park, with its kaleidoscope of colors, laughter, and eerie music filling the night. Amid the swirling fog and dim orange glow of flickering jack-o'-lanterns, a group of 5 teenagers wandered through the twisting paths of the carnival, their faces painted with carefree smiles. But the night had something darker planned for them. Max, the de facto leader of the group, strode ahead, dragging his friends to every ride and attraction. His enthusiasm was infectious, but as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. It was subtle at first, perhaps a trick of the mind, a whisper of cold air beneath the warmth of laughter, but soon it became undeniable. The Ferris wheel loomed over the horizon, its creaky metal frame casting long shadows. The lights of the carnival flickered, not with the expected joy, but with a flicker of something wrong. Sarah, the quiet one of the group, felt it first. She tugged on Max's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that?" Max turned, his brow furrowing. "See what?" But she couldn't quite explain. It was something lurking just at the corner of her eye, a shadow that moved too fast, a figure in the distance. She brushed it off. It was Halloween, after all. People in costumes, tricks and pranks, it was all part of the night. The group continued through the park, their footsteps crunching on the scattered leaves, the clowns and ghouls on stilts waving at passers-by. The crowd was thick, yet it felt strangely hollow, like an unseen presence stalked their every move. Then came the first sound, the faint honk of a clown's nose, distant but growing closer. The group stopped, exchanging puzzled glances. Clowns were a staple at the carnival, of course, but this one felt different. Max turned to his friends, a grin breaking across his face. "It's just part of the fun, guys. Let's keep moving." But as they walked, the honking followed, growing louder, more insistent. The figure appeared ahead, a man in a tattered clown's suit, standing by a rotting wooden bench. His makeup was smeared, the white paint running like tears down his face, his red wig tangled and matted. He stared at them with eyes too wide, too unblinking. Sarah's heart raced as she nudged Max again. "Max, he's not one of the carnival clowns." Max laughed, though it sounded forced. "Come on, Sarah, it's Halloween. They're supposed to be creepy." But as they passed by, the clown's head turned, his gaze never leaving them. His hands, gloved in filthy white fabric, twitched at his sides. "Let's get out of here," Jake, the youngest of the group, muttered. They hurried on, weaving through the crowds, but no matter how far they went, the clowns seemed to be behind them, lurking in the shadows, always watching. The honking grew louder, now mixed with the faintest sound of chains clinking together. The once lively atmosphere of the carnival had transformed into something oppressive, suffocating. The lights of the rides flickered, the music slowing to an eerie, distorted tune. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every face twisted into a grotesque mask of terror. Finally, they reached a quieter part of the park, a forgotten corner where old rides lay abandoned. The laughter and noise of the crowd felt miles away now. But the clown was closer than ever. He stood at the entrance to the dilapidated funhouse, a grotesque smile painted across his face. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was not part of the show. He never had been. Max swallowed hard. "Okay, guys, let's leave. Now." But as they turned, they realized the path back was no longer clear. The fog thickened, swirling around them like ghostly tendrils, and in the distance, more clowns appeared, silent, faceless figures in tattered costumes, blocking every exit. They were trapped. The fog enveloped the group like a shroud, thickening with every step they took, its damp fingers brushing against their skin. It moved unnaturally, swirling in patterns that defied the wind, creeping closer, as though it had a mind of its own. The carnival sounds faded into distant echoes, swallowed by the mist, and the garish lights that once illuminated their path flickered and died. Silence reigned, broken only by the strained breathing of the teenagers. Max, whose confidence had driven them earlier, now looked over his shoulder every few seconds, his bravado cracked. The laughter and clamor of the park were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Only the low, hollow honk of a clown's horn echoed in the distance, a sound that now carried a weight of malevolence. He glanced at his friends, trying to muster a smile, but even that effort failed him. "Stay close," Max muttered, but his voice trembled. They obeyed, huddling together, as if the closeness could shield them from whatever stalked them in the shadows. Sarah's eyes darted around, wide with fear, and Jake, always the one to crack jokes, was silent, his face pale under the flickering carnival lights. Behind them, the clown figure stood at the entrance to the funhouse, unmoving, a monument of grotesque mockery. His painted face, a smear of white and red, glowed faintly in the fog, eyes like empty voids staring straight at them. The grin stretched across his face seemed wider now, impossibly wide, as though his very flesh had been twisted to accommodate a smile that should never have been. "He's still there," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, yet trembling with the terror none of them could deny any longer. Max turned, his eyes locking with the clown's gaze, those eyes, those inhuman, abyssal eyes. For the briefest moment, Max felt something ancient stir within him, as if this creature, this obscene parody of joy, had been waiting in the fabric of the world far longer than any of them had been alive. The air felt heavier, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him from all directions. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted. A low rumble, subtle at first, but growing in intensity, vibrated through the earth. It was as if something immense stirred beneath them, waking from a long and restless sleep. The fog pulsed, moving like a living thing, thickening, thinning, and then contracting as though it had become sentient, drawn to their fear. Max's breath hitched in his throat as he felt an overwhelming sensation of dread, as though something in the fog had just noticed them. "Max." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her hand clutching his arm with a death grip. "Look." From the mist, vague shapes began to emerge. Not the shapes of clowns, but something far worse. Faceless figures, malformed and barely human, writhed at the edges of their vision. They were no longer in a carnival. This place, whatever it had become, was a space between worlds, a grotesque parody of reality. The clown, now the focal point of their horror, seemed to command the mist, as though it had summoned this place, this void. Jake stumbled, his foot catching on something unseen. "We need to go back. There's gotta be a way out. This can't be real." But Max knew better. The fog had not simply obscured their path. It had shifted the world around them. The air smelled wrong, cloying and rotten, like something ancient and decayed that had been unearthed. He felt a tremor of pure panic worm its way into his bones, but he couldn't show it. "Not yet." "Keep moving," he growled, though his voice betrayed the terror clawing at his chest. "We have to find a way out. There's always a way out." They pushed forward, stumbling blindly through the twisting fog, the echo of that faint honk pursuing them relentlessly. No matter how fast they moved, it seemed to close the distance, growing louder, as if the creature behind them delighted in their fear. Suddenly, they reached a small clearing, a forgotten corner of the park, where an old, decrepit carousel stood. Its painted horses were faded and cracked, their glassy eyes staring into oblivion. The carousel creaked as it turned slowly, though no one rode it. The music, warped and discordant, played in uneven notes, like the last breaths of a dying creature. Jake pointed. "There, maybe we can hide." But Max hesitated. Something about this place felt wrong. The air was thick with an ancient malevolence, as though they were being watched not by one creature, but by a legion of unseen eyes, observing from the cracks in reality. The ground beneath the carousel seemed to pulse with the same strange rhythm that had stirred the fog. Sarah took a step forward, her hand reaching for one of the broken horses. The moment her fingers touched the cold, peeling paint, a grotesque shudder ran through the carousel. The entire structure creaked and groaned, as if alive, and the music warped into a guttural, mocking laugh. The horses' mouths opened, revealing rows of sharpened teeth, their eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. They were no longer simple carnival attractions. They had become something far more horrifying. Max grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her back. "No! Don't touch anything!" As they stepped away, the honking sound grew louder, impossibly close now. The clown emerged from the fog again, his crooked smile never wavering. Behind him, the carousel creaked to life, the horses moving with a malevolent energy. The fog swirled faster, whipping around them in a frenzy. And then, with a voice as cold and hollow as the void itself, the clown laughed. The sound of the clown's laughter echoed through the night, a twisted, mocking sound that sent shivers racing down their spines. It was not the jovial chuckle of a performer, nor the carefree giggle of a fool. It was deeper, a noise that seemed to vibrate in the very air, carrying with it an ancient malice. The fog around them pulsed in response, as if animated by the sickening noise, moving in ways that defied logic and reason. Max's grip tightened on Sarah's wrist as they backed away from the carousel, the grotesque figures of the horses now turning in a slow, deliberate circle, their gleaming eyes locked onto the group. The others had fallen into a dazed silence, the terror in their minds so overwhelming that it threatened to paralyze them. Jake, usually the joker, stared at the clown with wide eyes, his lips quivering, but no words came. He was transfixed by the figure, a tall, monstrous silhouette that seemed to swell with the growing darkness around it. The clown's face, painted in the grotesque colors of false joy, was now a mask of something far worse than fear. Beneath the smeared makeup, the skin seemed to pulse, as though something underneath was struggling to break free. As the group stumbled backward, they were met with a sudden realization: every path they might have taken, every escape route, was gone. The fog was not merely mist, but a wall, dense and unyielding. The carnival, once a sprawling landscape of lights and games, had now folded in on itself. What remained was a twisted reflection of the real world, a perverse, decaying version of the park they had once known, one where the rules of nature and sanity had long since collapsed. Max tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. His mind swirled with irrational thoughts, memories of dark stories and myths that he had always dismissed as fiction. But this felt different. It felt real in a way that defied explanation. The clown advanced slowly, its movements deliberate, its eyes glowing with that strange, unnatural light. And then, with an eerie grace, it stopped. The laughter ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. "Why us?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Why is this happening to us?" Max couldn't answer. There was no reason to give, no logic that could explain the horror that had befallen them. The clown, this thing, wasn't human. It wasn't a creature of the material world. It was something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking at the edge of nightmares, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, more violently this time. The earth itself seemed to groan, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. The carousel, now fully animated, spun faster and faster, the warped laughter of its horses filling the air as they moved in a frenzied dance. The lights above flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows across the group. And then, as if the world had shifted on its axis, they saw it. The fog parted briefly, revealing something beyond, a vast, swirling void, a darkness so deep it seemed to devour the light around it. In that darkness, they could glimpse shapes. Enormous, shifting forms that defied understanding, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were ancient beings from a time before time. Their outlines were vague, but the terror they inspired was unmistakable. Max staggered, feeling his sanity teeter on the edge. He had never believed in the supernatural, never considered that there might be things lurking beyond the veil of reality. But now, faced with the impossible, he felt his mind begin to unravel. The clown, the park, the fog, it was all connected to something much older, much darker. "We're not supposed to be here," Jake muttered, his voice hollow, his eyes glazed over. "This place, it's wrong." The clown stood at the center of it all, grinning, its presence somehow tied to the very existence of this twisted world. It was not merely a predator. It was a gatekeeper, a being that had existed long before this carnival had been built. Long before humanity had even crawled out of the primordial ooze. Max turned to his friends, desperation clawing at his chest. "We have to move. We can't stay here." But where would they go? Every direction seemed the same, an endless expanse of shifting fog and decayed structures, all circling the same abyss that waited hungrily at the edge of reality. The clowns, once human-like figures in tattered costumes, had transformed into twisted horrors, their faces now masks of bone and flesh, their eyes burning with the same unholy light as the gatekeeper. It was Sarah who spotted the funhouse first. She gasped and pointed, her finger trembling. "There! We have to go inside." Max followed her gaze, and there it was, the funhouse, standing like a decaying sentinel at the edge of the mist. Its garish colors were faded, the entrance yawning wide like the maw of some ancient beast. But something about it called to them, as though it was the last refuge in a world gone mad. Without another word, they ran, their feet pounding against the uneven ground. The clown's gaze followed them, but it did not pursue. Instead, it remained standing at the edge of the abyss, its grin widening as if it knew something they did not. They reached the entrance of the funhouse, panting, hearts pounding in their chests. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the darkness beyond the entrance was absolute. But there was no turning back. Behind them, the fog shifted, the shapes moving closer. Max hesitated for only a moment, then pushed open the door. Inside, the air was cold and stale, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they stepped into the dark. They had escaped the clown, but they had entered something far worse. As the door creaked shut behind them, the world outside was swallowed by the same impenetrable blackness that now surrounded them. The funhouse, if such a name could be applied to this malevolent structure, had no lights, no familiar shapes to guide them. It was as if they had stepped not into a building, but into a living void. The air was thick with the scent of rot, heavy with a sensation of being watched by something unseen, something far older than they could comprehend. Max's breath came in ragged gasps as he squinted into the darkness. The walls seemed to writhe with movement, though whether it was the trick of his terrified mind or something much worse, he could not tell. The ground beneath them, though solid, felt wrong, soft, yielding in places, as though they were walking on something that lived, or worse, something dead but not yet decomposed. "We need to find a way out," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It was a fragile sound, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive atmosphere. Jake clung to her side, his once joking demeanor now a hollow shell of the boy they had known. Max tried to take charge, pushing down the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. "Stay close. We can't get separated." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how futile they were. This place did not obey the laws of the physical world. Space twisted here, distorted like the fog outside, folding in upon itself in ways the human mind could not fully grasp. They pressed on, moving blindly through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. No sound escaped their footsteps, as though the very walls drank in every noise, amplifying only the steady thud of their hearts beating in their chests. Max's thoughts raced, the edges of his sanity fraying with each passing second. What kind of place was this? Was it even real? Or had they crossed into some other dimension, some plane where time and space no longer held meaning? Suddenly, Jake cried out, stumbling forward as the ground beneath him shifted violently. Max and Sarah turned, their flashlights now flickering in desperation, revealing a grotesque sight, a figure, half submerged in the floor, writhing in silent agony. It wore the tattered remains of a carnival worker's uniform, but its face was twisted into something far worse than mere death. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were pools of darkness, staring up at them with a madness that reflected their own creeping dread. Max recoiled, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Jake, step back," he shouted, grabbing his friend by the arm and pulling him away. But the creature, or corpse, whatever it had once been, did not follow. It merely sank deeper into the floor, as though consumed by the very building itself, until only the top of its head remained visible. "This place isn't real," Jake muttered, shaking his head as if to wake himself from a nightmare. "It can't be real." But it was real. Too real. The funhouse was no mere illusion, no fabrication of smoke and mirrors. It was a place of ancient power, older than the carnival, older than humanity itself. Max could feel it in the air, in the subtle shifts of the walls around them. This was a place where nightmares took form, where the very fabric of existence was stretched thin, allowing the horrors that lurked beyond to seep through. They moved forward again, though every step felt heavier, as though the air itself conspired to keep them trapped within its endless maze. The hallways twisted in ways that made no sense, leading them in circles, yet always deeper, always further from any hope of escape. And all the while, there was the laughter. That maddening, inhuman laughter. It echoed through the corridors, bouncing off the walls in impossible directions. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, like the mocking taunt of a predator toying with its prey. They came upon a room at last, its entrance marked by an archway of cracked mirrors. Max hesitated, but Sarah, trembling with fear, pushed forward. "We can't stay in the halls," she whispered. "Maybe this room, maybe there's a way out." The room was circular, with mirrors lining every wall. But the reflections they showed were not their own. Instead, the mirrors captured grotesque, distorted versions of them. Sarah's reflection was gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken, as though drained of life. Jake's mirrored form stood with limbs twisted unnaturally, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Max's reflection was worst of all. His skin was drawn tight over his skull, his eyes glowing with a sickly, pale light, and behind him, the shadow of the clown loomed, its features shifting and warping as though it were a fluid thing, not bound by any physical form. What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking as she stared into the impossible reflections. Her hands gripped her arms, as if the image could pull her through the glass. Max looked around, his mind barely holding on to sanity. "This isn't a funhouse," he said, his voice low, trembling with the weight of realization. "This is something older. Something far worse than we ever imagined." Jake, still staring at his own distorted image, began to sob quietly, the fear having stripped away all bravado. "We're never getting out of here, are we?" Before Max could respond, the laughter returned, louder now, closer. It filled the room, the sound reverberating off the mirrors, multiplying until it became a deafening chorus of twisted mirth. The mirrors began to shake, the reflections writhing as though they were alive, struggling to break free of the glass. Max felt the ground shift beneath them once more, and suddenly, the floor began to crack open. A deep, unnatural light poured from the fissures, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The mirrors trembled violently, and from within their depths, something began to emerge, something not of this world. And then, as the room threatened to collapse into madness, they heard it again, the voice of the clown, whispering from every direction at once. "Welcome to the show." The room exploded into chaos, as reality itself began to unravel. The room fractured under the weight of unseen forces, as though the very fabric of space and time had been rent apart. The laughter, that manic, discordant sound, filled the air with such intensity that it seemed to vibrate through their bones. The mirrors trembled violently, their surfaces warping until the distorted reflections of Max, Sarah, and Jake melted into a grotesque cascade of color and shadow. Max stumbled backward, gripping Sarah's arm as the ground beneath them gave way. It was not a physical collapse, but rather the sensation of being drawn into something far worse, a chasm not of the earth, but of the mind itself. The funhouse was unraveling, its form shifting into something altogether monstrous. The walls pulsed, no longer rigid wood and glass, but living tissue that throbbed with malevolent energy. Jake's scream was lost in the cacophony as he fell to his knees, clutching his head as if the sound of the laughter threatened to tear his skull apart. Max tried to move toward him, but found himself frozen in place, his legs anchored by an unseen force. He glanced down and saw the floor beneath him had become a mass of writhing tendrils, cold and wet, like the limbs of some deep-sea creature from unfathomable depths. "No!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos as she pulled Max free from the grip of the floor, though the effort nearly caused them both to fall. Together, they staggered backward, away from Jake, whose form was now consumed by the twisting, pulsating mass beneath him. His eyes, wide with terror, locked with Max's, a silent plea for help before the floor swallowed him whole. Max wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the oppressive, otherworldly force that dominated the air around them. The funhouse, once a mockery of carnival entertainment, had transformed into something far worse, an abomination of space and mind, a conduit to a place that defied all understanding. Through the distortion of the mirrors, Max saw it again, the clown. Its form was no longer human, but a shifting mass of grotesque shapes and colors, its face a twisted parody of joy. The wide, painted grin stretched impossibly, splitting its face as though it were tearing itself apart, revealing a darkness that throbbed with ancient, malevolent life. Its eyes gleamed, no longer mirthful, but cold, calculating, inhuman in every sense of the word. "Do you see?" the voice echoed in Max's mind, though the clown's mouth did not move. "Do you see the truth that lies beyond?" Max's vision swam, the edges of his perception blurring as his mind struggled to process what was happening. He felt Sarah's grip tighten on his arm, grounding him, keeping him from slipping fully into the madness that beckoned him. But even she could not stop the relentless pull of the funhouse, a place that was no longer bound by the physical laws of the world they had known. "We need to move," Sarah whispered, though her voice trembled with fear. "We can't stay here. It's alive." Max nodded, though he barely registered her words. His gaze was locked on the thing that had once been the clown, its form writhing and shifting as though it was made of pure, living chaos. There was no escape from it, not in the way they had imagined. The exits, the hallways, they had been illusions, tricks to keep them moving deeper into the labyrinth of madness. They stumbled forward, away from the room of mirrors, though every step felt like wading through thick, gelatinous air. The laughter still echoed, though more distant now, as though the creature had retreated momentarily, watching, waiting. But the funhouse itself continued to change, its walls becoming slick and organic, pulsating with every beat of their hearts. Max felt his mind fraying at the edges, his thoughts unraveling like the fabric of the funhouse. He could no longer tell where the building ended and the nightmare began. Perhaps they were the same, two sides of the same monstrous coin, both leading them toward the same inevitable conclusion. Suddenly, the hallway split, opening into a vast chamber that should not have existed within the confines of the funhouse. The space stretched endlessly in all directions, a cavernous abyss lined with jagged, spire-like structures that jutted from the ground like the teeth of some colossal, slumbering beast. The ceiling was obscured by swirling shadows, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon it, a grotesque, pulsating orb of sickly, green light. Sarah hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. What is that?" Max shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the orb. He could feel its pull, an ancient, malevolent presence that radiated from it, twisting his thoughts and warping his sense of reality. It was the heart of the funhouse, the source of its power, and the thing that had ensnared them. As they approached, the air around the orb seemed to vibrate with a low, otherworldly hum. Max's mind reeled, the sensation like 1,000 voices whispering at the edge of his consciousness, each one pulling him deeper into the madness. He knew, instinctively, that touching the orb would reveal everything, the truth of the clown, the funhouse, and the unimaginable horror that lay beyond. But it would also destroy them, body and soul, casting them into the same abyss from which the creature had emerged. "We can't," Sarah said, her voice a fragile whisper. "We can't let it win." Max hesitated, the temptation of the truth gnawing at him. What lay beyond the veil? What secrets did this place hold? And yet, a deeper part of him, a part still anchored in the reality they had known, knew that some truths were not meant to be uncovered. Some horrors were best left unseen. Before he could make a choice, the air around them thickened, and from the shadows, the clown emerged once more. Its form was no longer that of a jester, but something far older, far darker. It had shed its disguise, revealing the true nature of the entity that had taken them, an ancient, eldritch being that defied comprehension. Max felt the world tilt beneath him, the ground dissolving into a sea of black, as the creature spoke once more. "You've come this far," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 screams trapped beneath the surface. "Why not finish the journey?" The orb pulsed, and the choice was theirs. The funhouse had fully come alive. It was no longer merely a collection of mirrors and twisted paths, but an entity unto itself, a sprawling, malignant consciousness, bending the fabric of space around them. Max and Sarah stood in the heart of it, encased by the malevolent force that pulsed like the heartbeat of some cosmic nightmare. The distorted clown grinned from the mirror, its eyes two gleaming orbs of fathomless blackness, beckoning them deeper into the abyss. Max's thoughts became tangled with fragments of memories, half-remembered whispers of ancient texts, the kind that spoke of entities that existed before the earth had formed, beings from realms outside time and understanding. He had read them once, dismissed them as the ravings of madmen. Yet now, standing in this grotesque circus of reality and nightmare, he realized that perhaps madness had always been the truth. "The show is forever," the clown's voice slithered through the air, coming from every direction at once. It was no longer confined to the reflection, but seemed to fill the very fabric of the funhouse, its presence pressing in on Max's mind like a vice. Sarah, trembling beside him, muttered incoherently, her words an endless litany of prayers, pleas, and cries. She had descended into a place beyond terror, where the mind no longer comprehends what is real. Max wanted to comfort her, but he knew it was too late. They were all beyond salvation. Jake's fate had been a grim harbinger of what awaited them both. The mirrors surrounding them pulsed with an unnatural glow, flickering like the dying light of distant stars. The reflections no longer showed mere distortions of their bodies. They showed something else, something impossibly vast and ancient looming behind the glass. He could see glimpses of those towering shapes again, their presence expanding outward from the mirrors, as if they were on the threshold of breaking through into the physical world. There was no escape from this place. It was not a haunted house, not a fun house. It was a doorway to something else, a prison of cosmic design, meant to trap those who wandered too close to the edges of reality. Max's body trembled as a sudden understanding dawned on him, a revelation that sent icy fingers down his spine. The clown, this distorted jester of malice, was not merely a creature of evil. It was a sentinel, guarding the borders of worlds. The funhouse was a lure, a trap meant to ensnare the curious and the reckless, those who dared to peek beyond the veil of reality. He and his friends had stumbled into something they should never have encountered. And now, like moths drawn to a flame, they were being consumed by forces older than time, forces that existed before the universe had taken form. "Max," Sarah's voice came from somewhere far away, though she was still beside him. It was hollow, devoid of hope. "What happens now?" Max didn't respond. What could he say? That they were nothing but playthings for a cruel and indifferent universe? That the clown was merely the puppet of something far more incomprehensible? That their fate had been sealed the moment they entered the park? In that moment, the funhouse began to shift again. The mirrors no longer reflected them, they reflected the clown, the distorted figure of horror that had followed them relentlessly, growing larger with each flicker of the lights. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face as if its very form was unraveling into chaos. And then, the mirrors shattered. The sound was deafening, like the crack of thunder from some great cosmic rift. Shards of glass spiraled around them in a whirlwind, cutting through the air with malevolent precision. But as the glass fell, it revealed the true horror. The space beyond the mirrors was not a room, it was an infinite, black void. A gaping chasm where stars burned out like dying embers, and vast, unknowable things moved in the darkness. The funhouse had been the last vestige of their reality, a thin veneer over the endless expanse of the abyss. Now, with the mirrors shattered, they were exposed to the full horror of the void that lay beyond all creation. The clown, now an enormous, distorted figure with limbs that twisted unnaturally, stepped forward, its body flickering between dimensions. Its grin grew impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. Its eyes were nothing but empty pits, voids that reflected the very darkness that surrounded them. Sarah let out a final, piercing scream as the clown reached out with one impossibly long arm, its fingers curling like tendrils of some unspeakable thing from beyond the stars. She was pulled into the abyss before Max could even react, her form swallowed by the void, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. Max was alone now. The void stretched before him, infinite and cold, with the towering shapes of incomprehensible entities moving in the far distance. He could feel their gaze upon him, though they had no eyes. He could feel their presence pressing down on his mind, like a weight that threatened to crush him. The clown stood before him, the final barrier between him and the abyss. It did not move, but its presence was overwhelming. Max could feel the vastness of it, the eternity it represented, and the horror that lay in that understanding. There was no escape. There never had been. The park, the funhouse, the clown, these were just the masks worn by the infinite, unknowable cosmos to lure him in. The universe was not kind. It was not merciful. It was a void filled with madness, where the human mind was nothing but a fragile spark, destined to be extinguished. Max took one final breath and stepped forward, into the void, where the stars had long since died, and the darkness was eternal. And thus, the funhouse stood silent once more, its distorted mirrors waiting for the next unfortunate souls to wander too close, to be drawn into the endless game played by the cosmos. The clown's laughter echoed in the empty corridors, a promise of horrors yet to come.